Hello, everybody. Excited to be here. Thanks to NLP Logics and the link for putting this together, for introducing me. I mean, a little bit high expectations, but that's okay. So this is an exciting time. There's so much happening with AI, clearly. If you check out the news, there's a lot going on. And I like photos. My dad is a photographer, and there's sometimes you can see a photo and it captures a scene, a point in time, and you wonder what's the rest of the story around it. This is a classic picture, right? And it makes me think, maybe without my addition, of, people working in the future of work. And it got me thinking the other day. I noticed there was a photo that got a fair amount of attention. It's this one from Boris Eldagsen. He's a German photographer. He actually won first place at the Sony World Photography Awards. And it's called The Electrician, which I think is a great title. Now, some of you may have guessed, and others of you, I think, know, that this isn't really a photo in the way that we used to think of what photos are. No, Boris used generative AI to create this image, which is amazing. But a few years ago, people would have thought that was complete science fiction. But things have changed. In fact, things changed quickly. So this is a chart here that shows a number of tech companies and how quickly they went from 0 to 1 million users. And you can see a few popular names. You've got Netflix up here, took 3.5 years. Facebook did it in about 10 months. Pretty fast clip. ChatGPT did it in 5 days. Incredible speed. Now, some of you might think, okay, great. 1 million users, that's good, but that's not going to change the world, right? To do that, you need scale. Well, their velocity kept getting faster. In only 8 more weeks, they hit 100 million users. Incredible. The world has never seen that fast of an adoption of technology. But that's just one company and one application, yet it changed everything. Now we've got this feeding frenzy of AI. Now I want to talk briefly about what you could say is the opposite of ChatGPT, Blockbuster. There's a quote from who was the CEO at the time, Jim Keyes, in 2008. And he said, "Neither Redbox nor Netflix are even on the radar screen in terms of competition." And you might think, that's crazy. Why would he say that? Was he joking? Was he misquoted? No. My view is he was caught off guard. 2 years before they went bankrupt, he believed this. The problem is everything changed. It reminds me of a quote from the book The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. In it, there's 2 men that are having a conversation. One man asks the other man, "So how'd you go bankrupt?" And the other guy says, "Well, 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly." And that's what happens with emerging technologies, this exponential change, that hockey stick that we've all seen. That's what ChatGPT did. And you can see on the right a number of technologies and how quickly they've been created and adopted. And the velocity is going faster and faster and faster. So no, it wasn't that the internet, or it wasn't that AI destroyed Blockbuster. No, it was the internet, you could argue, but actually it was the pace of change. They had a business model oriented for brick and mortar, a totally different game of how they wanted to sell their products. All of a sudden the internet comes in, you've got Redbox, you've got Netflix, and they couldn't keep up. Big companies couldn't stomach the change. Case in point on the left, you can see a number of companies in the Fortune 500, and this is how long they've lasted as a company on that list. In the 1950s, it was about 60 years. Now it's closer to 20 years. Every 2 weeks, a company is booted off the list. Again, because they're not moving fast enough. They're not taking advantage of these technologies like AI. It's a race. That's kind of my view, is that the challenge is for the incumbents to incorporate and adopt all of these new technologies faster than the startups can gain distribution. That's the race. And that is really one of the key focuses of what I want to talk about today, which is there's three points. One is that AI is disruptive. We saw the potential of other companies being disrupted. 2 is that it is inevitable, and that maybe that's okay, but the pace will continue. If not the same, it will get faster. But 3, all of us in this room have an important role to play. We can be bystanders, or we can step up and make certain decisions about how we want our future to look with and alongside AI. So what do we mean by AI? Each of us have different views of what it is. Our perspective of it has been really shaped over time by books and stories and movies. And there's been a lot of good ones over time. From Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a classic, 200 years ago. Some people view it as the first science fiction story. In it, you've got this mad scientist toiling away in a lab, bringing this artificial agent to life. And now we can think about a lot of the same ethical considerations that Mary Shelley must have been thinking about then. And we're facing them today. Or you've got Her, totally different movie, but this one is about a man after a breakup who fell in love with his virtual assistant, with the voice played by Scarlett Johansson. In this one, my view is it's all about our relationship with technology, how trusting we are, how we build these deeply personal relationships with AI and other technologies. Or, of course, we've got 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is a classic. And actually, people usually think of, refusing to open the pod bay door, but there was actually, when it first came out, critics had two different views. Some people did have that dystopian fear, but others saw this as a bright potential of the future. So while we typically focus on the negative, that's not always how people viewed it. But Terminator is not the same. Everybody sees that's just killer robots coming to destroy us all, right? I think what they fail to miss, and sometimes these stories, while they're fun, they're exciting, we start to think of painting this picture of the future, and we fail to forget what's happening today, whether you're building or asking others to build or using these technologies. That's why I think it's really important that we understand at least a little bit of how they work and how we can make sure that we're shaping them again to the way we want them to function in our lives. People have the view of, the Skynet and this very kind of artificial general intelligence of AI, and that's really not what we have today. It's a fun story, but it's not reality. What we have today is something closer to called narrow AI, very task specific. You ask data science teams like NLP Logics to solve a specific problem, try to constrain it as much as you can to build something with an idea of what is the outcome, right? But you're not going to ask for a model that does everything. Watson isn't also going to drive your car. It's just not how it works. Here's my definition of AI. It's really a broad and fluid category of computer science. And the reason I think it's broad is because it's not one technology. There's several. And it's fluid because every time we keep breaking barriers, we keep expecting more. The bar keeps rising. And the goal is we as humans want this AI to solve problems that we used to think only humans could solve. And we realize that we can't just constrain it to enough rules. We have to teach these machines through lots of examples how to learn. As an example, if you have a self-driving car, or you can imagine one, you as the car need to know what's coming in and out of your lane. Is that a plastic bag rolling in front of you or a toddler? You can't write enough rules to say this is exactly what either of those looks like, but you can, through millions of examples, learn over time. And that's how generally it works. AI has these three capabilities, I like to say, or superpowers: predicting, communicating, and seeing. Predicting is, let's say you go on to Netflix and it helps you figure out what movie or show you should watch next. On Amazon, it's going to help you figure out what you should buy. Or if you listen to Spotify, yes, it's going to have your playlist, but it's also going to help you figure out what songs and bands you might also like based on your past music history, people like you, and the songs that they've liked. For communication, think of that as Google. It's been around for 25 years. So simple. You type in a few keywords and boom, across millions of web pages, you're able to figure out or find exactly what you're looking for. Or you can interface with Alexa and Siri. Ask it to turn on a light switch, what the weather is, dozens of other things. And then lastly, we have seeing. AI can see things in images, objects, people, words. Here's an example. I took a screenshot of my Photos app, and I had been looking for fish. 206 photos of fish. I don't know why I have so many pictures of fish. That's not the point. But you can see it did a good job, right? It found mostly bass and shark. And at the bottom, what surprised me was that it also found on this package, I think from Greenwise here, I said the word fish on the label. So the AI knew that there is both a fish that swims in the water and one with the word written out on a package. It can see both and understand both well enough to solve my problem of finding my fish. Recently, AI got a new capability. We're all very excited for it. Now it can create, right? It can summarize, it can write code, it can do all sorts of new things with these tools like ChatGPT. And a lot of folks will think, okay, you can either create images or interface with text, but there's a whole host of things that you can do with generative AI. Across code, like I mentioned, very natural speech creation, creating videos, 3D environments for games, or even in biology, creating new drugs and drug compounds. So the way I like to think of it is it's almost like a menu of sorts. Up top are the different things you can do, the things you can create with this capability. And on the bottom, it's almost like the ingredients. And yes, you need to bring data, but those are the things that are now possible. The question again is, what are you going to choose to build? And how are you going to choose to build it? We've got a couple case studies. So there's the tale of two AIs. Now, AI can create, like I mentioned, incredible drugs. This, just in June of this year, in silico, created a new drug that had never existed. The AI figured out how to solve the problem and how to build the drug molecules. And it did it in a way that saved, it was a tenth of the cost and a third of the time. So the AI has the potential to create a healthier future for all of us. Pretty exciting. Or it can be used to generate fake images that can terrify all of us. Same general idea of the AI, but all of a sudden it's used in a completely different, destructive, scary way. AI can be used to create a healthier planet. There's a company called Nocatee, and they've found a way to make very tasty foods for a sustainable future, using now 84% less CO2 emissions and 78% less water. That's great for all of us, right? As long as it's tasty. Or it can do something else really important, like help us imagine what the Pope would look like in a Balenciaga jacket. Both are important. It just depends on what you're into. And then lastly, AI can make all of us smarter. AI has the potential for everyone in the world, and this is from Bill Gates, he believes this, everyone in the future will have their own agent, their own tutor that helps us all learn. No child will be left behind across the globe. Or it can help us imagine what Johnny Cash would sound like singing Barbie Girl.
I'm a Barbie girl in a Barbie world. Life is plastic, it's fantastic. You can brush my hair, undress me everywhere.
Again, both are important. Both can change the world. Now let's talk a little bit more about how AI works. So when people talk about AI, what they're really referring to is machine learning. And there's three main ways that we teach machines to learn: supervised, unsupervised, and reinforcement learning. For supervised learning, think of that as anytime you have a bunch of examples in the past with labels, and you want to identify a result and you've got an idea of what you're looking for. We'll talk about that more in a second. Unsupervised machine learning is where you don't have labels. Let's say you're in marketing and you're trying to figure out different patterns or categories of buyers, and you're looking at people who have bought things from your store, and you want to find out if there's early adopters or laggards and different types of consumers, so you can tailor your marketing for each of them. AI can automatically figure that out. You don't have to tell it, it'll figure it out. Or if you're in financial services, AI can figure out the trends of your shopping behavior. How do you use your credit card? And it'll see, well, I know where you shop, when, how much. And all of a sudden, if things look different, it'll flag that as fraud. Okay, that's helpful. And the third is reinforcement learning, which actually comes from B.F. Skinner from years ago, if you remember, in psychology. It's all about punishment and reward. We'll come back to that in a second, too. Supervised learning, this is actually a house just a few blocks from here. Imagine your goal is to predict the value of a home. You have lots of features, bedrooms, bathrooms, you know the location of the home, and your goal is to figure out how much it's worth. Supervised learning is a great use case for that. We've got years and years of history of examples to help inform and build this predictive model. And that's exactly how the model would end up working. Now you can use many more features, but this is a simple understanding. And every time a house sells, it's going to update all of those parameters if it was right or wrong, so it's a little bit more right next time. And that's where the learning piece comes in. Now, reinforcement learning is a bit different. Think of that, I mentioned punishment and reward, as though you're trying to teach a game how to play, or an AI agent how to play a game. Here, let's use the example of Snake. So on the left is an AI that's just figuring it out. It's trying to learn. What you're going to do is you're going to teach it the rules. If you remember Snake, you can go up, down, left, right. Your goal is to get those little dots. That's your food. You get points. That's your reward if you're successful, agent. If you hit the walls, you die, you lose points. Okay? We can teach a kid that, and they'll figure it out over time. The AI agent will do the same thing, playing millions upon millions of times, improving and perfecting, eventually playing the perfect game. You can see on the right, it's pretty darn good. Now, what's interesting about reinforcement learning is, again, the pace and the velocity of how much better it's gotten is really shocking. So in 2013, that was state of the art to play Space Invaders or Snake. Okay, like that was the best you could expect. Which is cool, but like, no one's going to pay us to do that, I don't think. And then in 2016, maybe you remember when Lee Sedol, who was the world champion at the game Go, he lost to AI. He lost to essentially a reinforcement learning model. And I love it. Every time someone loses at a sport to an AI, there's this like, how could I lose to an AI? Anyways, then in 2019, this is what, just 4 years ago, Dota 2 and StarCraft were beaten. And this is a multiplayer, multi-turn game, very complex. Nobody expected that an AI could ever beat these players, the best in the world at this game. And they surpassed it in 2019. And then most recently, this actually came out just a month ago. Now this is where, to me, it gets really interesting. Now all of a sudden, the AI went outside of the video game, and it's able to actually play in the real world. There's something called drone racing. You've seen people play with drones outside, but people will race through these courses. And just last month, they figured out how they can beat the best in the world at this. What I'll show you here is a video of some people watching it in real life for the first time. In the real world, you saw the speed at which, it's true, no human can do that. And all of a sudden, the AI is doing all of this in the physical, real world. I think maybe one of my favorite parts about it is the title, reaching the limit. And I think a lot of times that's what we want to do, right? Whether it's at work, whether it's physically, wherever in your lives you want to reach the limit. And it reminds me of this quote from George Lee Mallory. In the 1920s, he was one of the first expeditioners to try to climb Mount Everest. And somebody asked him, why did you decide you wanted to climb it? And his response was, because it's there. And I think that we often have that mentality, right? We want to believe, we know it's possible, so we strive and we push, whether it's building an AI or pushing ourselves physically. And that's why I make the point that I think that the future of AI continuing to progress is inevitable, because we want it to be. There's too much competition for it not to be. So why now? Why can all of a sudden these drones race around like that when years ago they couldn't come close? Well, it really comes down to the fact that all of a sudden now we have a lot more data and processing power that makes these deep learning models insanely powerful. That actually works. And there's 4 primary factors. So one is we have way more data than we've ever had before. You think back to the 90s and 2000s when everything went digital. How we bought, how we communicated, everything was on the internet or on our smartphones. People were taking all sorts of selfies, and all of that information was fuel for these models. And the cost of storage came down as well. Next, we have much more powerful and efficient compute. It is, you've probably heard of Moore's Law, the idea that every 12 to 18 months, the number of processing kind of power is going up dramatically. So everything's getting smarter. And it's also getting cheaper. So not only can you do more, you can do more with less. Then you look at the fact that the money supply, over $160 billion last year went into AI companies. There's a lot more chance to experiment, to keep pushing the needle. And then finally, we've got the size of the models. Now this is in logarithmic scale. You can see another exponential with massive, massive models. So now all of a sudden, Google's Palm model has 500 billion parameters. Think of those as tiny little decisions that are being used to optimize and inform a decision, or some of these large language models. And what does that get you? Well, we're surpassing human benchmarks. Early on, we could pass handwriting recognition, speech recognition, image recognition, and you can see the bar, the benchmark there is 0. So the AI is better than us. And many of us don't want to admit it, but it's true. AI is better than us at many of these simple tasks. And you might think, okay, great, that's not that exciting. But now ChatGPT has shown how it can pass other tests that we used to think only humans, not even all humans can pass. ChatGPT can pass it. Whether that's the law exam, a Wharton MBA exam, multiple medical exams, or my favorite, 3 levels of the sommelier exam, which is for wine tasting. Now, I'll admit, it was just for the theory portion, not the tasting, but I believe ChatGPT can pass that next year. So we talked about that quote, gradually then suddenly. This is brought to life. The picture, the visible proof that that's happening. So back in 2014, these are images from research papers. And you can see the one on the far left. It's grainy, it's almost smudgy. You can see that it's a person, but it's not great. It really went from kind of laughable to passable to really impressive by 2018. I mean, admittedly, I don't think that I would be able to tell the difference between that and a real human. But that was still the research era. All of this was in a lab, in a very controlled, contained setting. It's not at scale. Now, we're in the modern era, where any of us could go on to DALL-E or Midjourney and create a lifelike image in seconds for pennies, for better or worse. So we're going to watch a quick video about DALL-E and how that works in terms of image creation.
Have you ever seen a polar bear playing bass? Or a robot painted like a Picasso? Didn't think so. DALL-E 2 is a new AI system from OpenAI that can take simple text descriptions like a koala dunking a basketball and turn them into photorealistic images that have never existed before. DALL-E 2 can also realistically edit and retouch photos based on a simple natural language description. It can fill in or replace part of an image with AI-generated imagery that blends seamlessly with the original. It's called in-painting. In January 2021, OpenAI introduced DALL-E, a system that can generate images from text, like this avocado armchair. DALL-E 2 takes the technology even further with higher resolution, greater comprehension, and new capabilities, like in-painting. It can even start with an image as an input and create variations with different angles and styles. DALL-E was created by training a neural network on images and their text descriptions. With deep learning, it not only understands individual objects, like koala bears and motorcycles, but learns from relationships between objects. And when you ask DALL-E for an image of a koala bear riding a motorcycle, it knows how to create that or anything else with a relationship to another object or action. The DALL-E research has 3 main outcomes. First, it can help people express themselves visually in ways they may not have been able to before. Second, an AI-generated image can tell us a lot about whether the system understands us or is just repeating what it's been taught. Third, DALL-E helps humans understand how AI systems see and understand our world. This is a critical part of developing AI that's useful and safe.
I love the end. AI that's useful and safe. I showed this video a couple weeks ago, and a guy I was talking to after, his biggest complaint about it, he's from Australia, and he said, we showed koala bears. And he's like, there's no such thing as koala bears. I was like, okay, fine, but even if you're right, then it's even more impressive because it knew what a koala bear was and how to put it on top of a motorcycle. It's amazing. And when you see the technology and how crazy it is, the ability to do these things that seemed, again, like science fiction years ago, it shouldn't be a surprise that we're seeing more and more talk in the media, that we're seeing more and more mentions of AI by companies. So this is a chart since about 10 years ago. In the quarterly earnings releases, how often AI is referenced by companies. And you can see, I love charts that go up and to the right, clearly. But this one, again, you can see 100 times in Q1 it was mentioned, and 46 of those times were about generative AI, which is a quarter only after it came out, after ChatGPT came out. It's incredible, the amount of attention in the world. So it's easy to think with all of this, all these charts, and everything's exponential, everything's moving faster, that we should just, all right, put everything on AI and just give up hope that we have any real stance in the world. But I would argue, hold on, because AI still struggles to know the difference between a chihuahua and a blueberry muffin. And I'll admit, I do too. So that's just one of the challenges, right? AI isn't perfect. There's several challenges that companies face when they're trying to deploy artificial intelligence. And this image here, I think, does a good job kind of portraying that. If you first look at the image and the prompt, at a first glance, you think, yeah, that's a spot on, nailed it, right? And then you realize the woman here, the second one in, has 3 legs. And that's not right, right? That's a hallucination, right? That these AIs, whether it's an image or in text, you'll hear the same thing, where it's kind of like an improv actor. It will confidently make things up, but it's hard to tell because it seems so real. So that's just one of the challenges that companies are struggling with these days. 3 others that come to mind for me that I've seen. One is data. People often think they have a lot more data and that it's more pristine than it actually is. Getting that data into a place, into an environment where you actually can do the modeling and build something is easier said than done. Second, and this is maybe surprising to some of you in the room, is it can be hard to figure out what to build. What's a use case that's actually worth it? Will get the ROI that you're looking for. Because unlike software development, we were talking about this earlier today, you can know the rules, you can know what you're going to build, and you can say, all right, if you build this, it's worth that. But you don't know how well the AI will work in the real world. And then third, you have integration. It can be relatively easy to build a model on your laptop or in a contained environment. To integrate with other systems is challenging. It takes buy-in often, which people are harder than machines typically. The other challenge is what's called responsible AI. And there's 3 real kind of focus areas here that we should consider. One is bias and ethics. Are we, just because we can build something, should we? Are we going to be glad that this thing exists in the world once we deploy it? Are we perpetuating bias of the past, or can we find a way to improve it for the future? More and more transparency is key. We need the ability to understand how the model works so that we can explain it. So in certain environments like financial services, if someone asks for a loan, you have to be able to explain how you came to that conclusion. And if you can't explain it, especially with the very, very complex models, you're not going to be able to deploy it. And then third is accuracy. Does your model accurately predict what you think it should predict? Okay? That seems obvious, but it's still very important. Let's look at 3 or 4 examples. I think there's 4 here. First is source data biases. So a few years ago, this is in 2018, Amazon was on a they were growing very quickly. Lots of people wanted to work there, and I think people still do. And they wanted to find a way to spend more time with the candidates who were the best fit and less time with the ones who they really felt like weren't going to be a good fit for the company. So they built an AI that would be able to look at all of the resumes that came in and only select and pass along the ones that were the right fit. The problem is Amazon, like a lot of tech companies, is mostly men. So the model was heavily geared to optimize for men. Now, Amazon, you could say, did the right thing. They took out race, gender, some of those other demographic kind of indicators that you wouldn't want in the model. The problem was the AI figured it out. It outsmarted them. It saw words like women's, as in women's chess club champion, in the rest of the resume and figured out the association. Or if it's on softball, it would figure it out. So all of those people were penalized for being women, even though they tried not to. Or you've got security flaws. 2 examples here. On the right are some stop signs with black and white tape on it. There were some hackers, as they were called. They were just students at the University of Washington who figured out you can fool a self-driving car system into essentially not seeing a stop sign by placing those pieces of tape exactly like that. So 84% of the time, your car would just fly right through the stop sign. Kind of scary. Or more recently, you may have heard of these coding tools like GitHub Copilot that help developers write code faster, more efficiently. They're kind of a pair programmer, but AI. And a challenge, this is a report that just came out, is that it's more likely that they're creating more security vulnerabilities while they're using these tools, but also they're more confident in their code. So it's doubly challenging because they believe it's better, when in fact it's actually probably worse. The third is the usage flaw. So you can put something out like ChatGPT into the world or self-driving, and you don't always know how it's going to be used, and that can become a problem. So you may have heard of the ChatGPT lawyer, which could be like a cool name, but it's not for him because it didn't go well. So Stephen Schwartz, he had a tough case. He had to prove why his case should move forward in the court system. And he was able to quickly, a tough deadline, we've all had this. And he put together this list of, I think, 10 or 12 different cases. And he was so proud of it. He was like, yeah, I got this. And the judge came back to him and said, I can't find any of these. And he then realized, sadly, and you can see the quote, well, it starts with this. I heard about this new site, which is like never, that's not going to go well. And then he says, I didn't comprehend that ChatGPT could fabricate cases. Well, everybody figured it out after he did that. So obviously, his hand was slapped, and now I don't think lawyers are ever allowed to use ChatGPT ever again. I'm joking about that. Or we have Tay. Now this is a bad one. So Microsoft was trying to be really cool. So they decided, you know what, Twitter's a thing now, it's 2016. Let's build this chatbot that's really targeted for a younger audience, okay? And the way they built it, it was continuously learning. Remember when I talked about your home valuation and how it can continue that feedback loop? Well, what they did is that people could interface and talk to this Tay chatbot and teach it things. Well, and you can see the quote here, is Tay went from humans are super cool to this terrible Nazi, and it says 24 hours. It was actually 16 hours because the developers were so busy quickly flagging and trying to take down all of its tweets, they couldn't keep up because it was just terrible, awful person. But that's largely because Twitter is also full of terrible, awful people, but that's a separate topic. So you might think, okay, people think about some of these tools, they're like, it's not a big deal, a good explanation for ChatGPT is all it's doing is predicting the next word. What's the next best word? Like that seems harmless, like what could go wrong, right? Well, the challenge, and some of these studies have shown, is that we spend a lot of time doing that type of work. About 60% in America of our time is spent on language-based tasks. And that translates to about 2/3 of jobs and tasks are expected to be impacted in some way over the next 5 years. McKinsey and Goldman Sachs did a related study, and they found that productivity for companies could be increased by 1.5 to 3.3%, which is great for the companies, right? And that, again, is a reason why companies want these tools. They want to be more productive, and I don't blame them for it. That's the race. We have to keep competing. And this other stat shows that 19% of workers will have half of their job impacted or potentially impacted by these tools like ChatGPT. Let's make it a little bit more real. Here's a quote from Dan Bricklin, cool looking guy, right? He said, I was doing all this work and my coworkers thought I was amazing. People thought I was a wonderkind, but I was just using this tool. But if you know Dan Bricklin, that's not Dan. This is Dan Bricklin. And he said this in 1979 after he invented the spreadsheet. And you might think, okay, good joke, David. But what happened to all the accountants? Well, what happened is we needed more of them. The cost of hiring an accountant went down because they could all be more productive. So what we actually saw is that after VisiCalc and Excel were released, we saw actually more accountants being hired. But that's not always the case, and I know that. So another report here shows from 1870 to 1930. It's a labor report. You can see agriculture is circled there, the number of farmers. No surprise, there's less farmers now than there used to be. Got tractors, automation, all of that. But what you don't see here in terms of occupations is data scientist, engineer, product manager. Whole new classes of jobs have come up that didn't exist. And I think back to that chart of the Fortune 500 companies, right? It's not like we have a Fortune 5 now because all those companies were displaced. No, new companies took their spot. Just like new jobs are taking the spot of those jobs that we don't need as much anymore. And that's why a lot of companies are really focused on reskilling and upskilling. Yes, they're hiring AI talent, but they're also teaching us how we can use AI tools effectively. Now, some people will say, you can take my job, but don't touch my music. I don't think people would actually say that, but there is something to the fear of music. It feels more personal. It feels like kind of the last uncharted domain that's going to be impacted by technology. But several weeks ago, actually, 2 different artists released AI-generated music. One of them is David Guetta, and we'll hear from him in a minute. And the other is someone who goes by the name Ghostwriter977. And he's a ghostwriter. He has other people who actually sings his songs. And he released a song called Heart on My Sleeve. And it went viral, essentially. Tens of millions of people listened to it the first few days. Fans loved it. The voices sounded like Drake and The Weeknd, 2 wildly popular musicians. The fans didn't realize it wasn't actually those musicians. This ghostwriter person cloned the voices of those musicians to make the song. And that sparked all sorts of questions. How could they do it? Who did it? How do I sue them, right? But I think the biggest question that a lot of people were surprised by is, like, how did he pull this off? So let's hear from David Guetta, and he'll explain it.
This is the future rave sound. I'm getting lost in another ground. This is the future rave sound. I'm getting lost in another ground.
Eminem, bro. It's something that I made as a joke. Was so good at Eminem. I discovered those websites that are about AI. Basically, you can write lyrics in the style of any artist you like. So I typed, write a verse in the style of Eminem about future rate. And I went to another AI website that can recreate the voice. I put the text in that and I played the record and people went nuts.
I love how excited he is to tell the story. He's like a little kid, like he just found a new toy. And it's also just shockingly simple. He just went to a couple websites, and tens of millions of people listen to those songs. So to kind of wrap some of this up and to pull it together, you could say there's a case study that I want to talk about, which I think is really interesting. Michael Kaczynski, he's a researcher in Stanford. He had partnered with, I think, Cambridge University on a set of studies in around 2012. And his goal was to figure out how the signals we leave on the internet can be used to inform big tech about who we are as people, our personality, and other things. And what he found was pretty interesting. With only 60 interactions, the AI can know you about as well as your friend. Double that to about 120, it can know you about as well as your family. With about 300 interactions, likes, clicks, comments, things like that, it can know you and your personality about as well as your spouse. So we've got another quick video that's going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Clicking like on Facebook is something most of us do without thinking.
The University of Cambridge over in London actually did a study of what people like on Facebook to try to determine facts about them that they wouldn't otherwise know. So they didn't just look at the products, the movies, the bands that people like. They also looked at the status updates that people like, the photos that people like. And they were able to draw some really, really interesting conclusions about all of your likes that you're clicking can tell more about you than you might have realized, from your political values to your religion to your gender to your happiness to your age.
In fact, some parts of your identity can be predicted with 95% accuracy.
Accuracy was lowest, about 60% when it came to predicting whether a user's parents were still together when they were 21. People whose parents divorced before they were 21 tended to write statements about relationships. Drug users were ID'd with about 65% accuracy, smokers with 73%, and drinkers with 70%. Sexual orientation was also easier to distinguish among men, 88% right there. For women, it was about 75%. Gender, by the way, race, religion, and political views were predicted with high accuracy as well. For instance, white versus black, 95%.
Findings of a large privacy campaigners clear this research can be used to commercially exploit users.
So keep in mind that just because you think you're not revealing a lot of personal details on Facebook, you're still spreading the word to the outside world as well as those online warfare.
few friends liked walking with your friend and randomly pushing them into someone or something. Hey, it's not their fault they don't have friends. Everyone they know keeps getting randomly pushed into traffic. High IQ corresponds to liking Mozart, science, and the Colbert Report.
It's kind of crazy how much companies, these models, can know about us and the things we don't know that we've told the world. Now let's go back to those sets of studies and how that can be used. Again, when you think about personality, it may not seem like there's that much that can be useful, but you'd be surprised. By knowing if someone's extroverted or introverted, you can decide how you're going to shape as a marketer the language, the imagery, the tone of how you advertise. And that can make a big difference. And now there's companies like Persado here who have basically automated that end to end. So instead of having 3 or 4 segments, it can be basically n equals 1. They get hyper-personalized just for you to try to get you to spend a little more time on the site or to do something that maybe you wouldn't have thought of doing. And that brings us to 2014. There was a Facebook app, you may remember at the time, it was really popular to have these personality quizzes. And there was one called This Is Your Digital Life. And the idea was that you fill out this brief quiz and they would tell you what your spirit animal personality is, or what personality like a celebrity you have. Silly stuff. But they captured tens of millions of people filled out this survey, and their friends' data was also aggregated as well. Now, a company across the pond, as they say, Cambridge Analytica, bought that data from This Is Your Digital Life. And they combined that data with voter record data. Now, all of a sudden, Cambridge Analytica had some really interesting information about how people vote, how people think, what would get them to think differently. And the Trump campaign was able to use that information in 2016 to win the election. And this isn't a political point because both sides are doing it and they will continue to do it more and more. What it is it's a point about the power of what you can do with AI and its ability to influence our thinking and the language that we decide to use to win, to compete. We can't stop. The genie's out of the bottle, as they say. So, AI is powerful, has the power to disrupt. Its progress is inevitable. But third, we in this room do, and hopefully you see more and more, play a really critical role in deciding what we're going to build and how we're going to build it. So hopefully we end up with a smarter, healthier, and brighter future. Thank you.